So we are picking back up with our series that we kind of have a series within a series. We're doing a series on Job, but we've kind of taken a break from Job to go into a discussion of evil and suffering and why those things exist. And it's based, and I'll hold this up again, mostly on a book. Of course, we do a lot of talking here, and it doesn't just come from this, but this is kind of what the basis of the lessons is from a book by Thomas Warren called Have Atheists Prove There Is No God? And it deals with the atheist charge that because the Bible claims that God is all-powerful and that he's all good, that it's a contradiction that evil exists in the world. And so we've been discussing that. And last week we got into some specifics on, what was God's purpose in creating the world? And, no person, I don't think, can fully answer that question. We don't have the knowledge or the ability to know the mind of God as to what his purpose was in creating the world. But you guys remember what we talked about as to what one of the things that we do know for sure was a reason for creating the world. You remember what that was? All right, so it was right. It was created as a place to allow people to have the choice as to whether they're going to serve God or not. Basically, to give us the choice.
And we're also to enjoy this life that we have been given.
For us to enjoy the life that we've been given, and at the same time, it's what Warren calls it is it's a veil of soul making, and it's an opportunity that we have, or a probationary period, you might say, that we have. That been given to choose what we're going to do. And while we're here, we have the opportunity to enjoy things that he's given us and also to feel pain and suffering. And that's what we've been discussing is, why is there evil and pain and suffering in this world? And last week we discussed the characteristics of what are the characteristics of the ideal environment? What would it be? What would be the perfect world to meet the purpose of allowing people the opportunity to choose whether they're going to follow God or not, whether we're not going to serve God, whether we're going to reject God. So do you guys remember some of those items, what we discussed? What those what those characteristics would be? Uh-oh. Nobody remembers, huh?
The ideal would be, should God make this world just for him and his people? That would be
you mean the ideal where, yeah. Well,
would be,
the perfect world or what was whenever God, the way it was created, right? There was no death or suffering or pain or anything like that, sickness, whenever God first created the world. But as far as for his purpose of allowing us to make the choice, he made it that way. He made it the way he made it. And then but knowing that people were going to choose not to follow him, he made it also and designed it in a way that it would be changed to what we have today, which is this, world that's perfect basically for allowing us to have that choice. And some of the characteristics that we had talked about is that it couldn't be a world where we would only experience pleasure. If we could only experience pleasure and no pain or adversity, that would not be conducive to that purpose. Also, it needs to be one that would allow us to have that free choice, the free moral, the freedom to have moral choices. It would have to reveal God to us without overwhelming us. So in other words, we have to be able to see that God exists and to be able to know that he exists and that he's left us his desire and will through his word, but not be so, he would have to not be so in our face or so present in our lives that we would have no choice but to serve him. Like a dictator or whatever, where you're forced into it. It would have to be There'd have to be the right balance there. The ideal environment needs to provide for our needs while also challenging us, providing opportunity for growth in various ways, through physical challenges or mental challenges, those kind of things. And I would also say that the ideal environment would have enough enough pleasures, things that rewards, you might say, to make us long for a permanent home with Him. That kind of comes from the book that Ted Decker wrote about how, I think it's called The Slumber of Christianity, and where he talks about that as Christians we should see the blessings that we have here on this world as being a foretaste, just a precursor to what we'll have in heaven, and see it that way. So that would be important. And then, of course, the environment around us has to be conducive, or something that would allow us to correctly deduce that He exists and that the God of the Bible is the one true God. The ideal environment would also be one in which things that occur are insignificant as far as on the level of eternity, when you think about it from eternal perspective, but to us it's greatly important. Like what's going on around us in our lives today are greatly important, but at the end of the day, what is important is whether we're serving God or not. So it allows for that dynamic. So that's what we discussed last week, and I asked the question at the end of the class, does the world possess these characteristics? And of course, the answer to that is yes, because we're kind of taking from the characteristics that the world has and saying, does that make sense to meet the purpose for what God created the world? So here's the question that I wanted to start this week's lesson off with, and that is, how might someone say that the world could be modified or changed to be better for God's purpose of soul making? How would, if there was, how might somebody argue that, well, the world should be different? And of course, you have to put that caveat. If you don't put the caveat in and you said, if you just say, how might the world be better? Well, what's your automatic answers that you're going to get? Well, get rid of evil and pain and suffering and all those things. And that might be the case, so that you could say that. But if you were to answer that question that way, what would you be doing? You would actually be changing completely, and it would no longer suit the purpose. You would be changing the world completely, and it would no longer suit the purpose that God created it for. So just a couple of things to think about there. A world in which it was absolutely guaranteed that not even one instance of evil could occur could not work as this veil of soul making, as Warren calls it. The Bible teaches that the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain are not the reason the world was created. Like, we know that. And how do we know that? Well, what did Jesus do for us? He died on the cross, right? So that kind of goes back to one of those things that I learned in school and from my parents. As a leader, you try to, I also learned it from coaches as well. As a leader, you try not to ask anything of your players or your subjects or whoever's following you that you are not willing to do. So, like when I'm at home, if I'm going to ask my children to clean something, I have to lead by example and clean those. Like, I can't ask them to clean something in their room that I'm not willing to do in my room, right? Or things like that. Like, we have to lead by example, and so in that way, God sent His Son to die one of the cruelest deaths that someone could die, on a cross. So He has already set the example that He's willing to go through the pain, and the suffering that we will endure here. An atheist may claim that our world would be better if no natural calamities ever occurred. And we've seen a lot, especially in today's, natural calamities have always been there. They've always been around. But in today's news and in our hyper politicized things here, We hear more about these storms and you know, how climate change is causing them and all of this, which my intent is not to argue that discussion at all here, but we hear more about it. It's more out in front of our face now, or always present. You hear more about earthquakes, you hear more about the hurricanes and the storms and all those kind of things. And that's just because we have more communication nowadays than what we did back several years ago. So an atheist may claim that our world would be better if no natural calamities ever occurred, or if there were no instances of animal pain, or if there was no human suffering, if there was no sin. They would say, well, wouldn't the world be better if all those things weren't there? And so let's think about what are the implications of saying that. What would happen if none of those things existed in our world?
God is the one that created the world for his purpose. And due to that, we have, if every individual on the face of this earth had the heart of King David, who had the heart of God, boy, wouldn't everything be great? But that defeats God's purpose.
Right, okay, yeah. Well, yeah, because we all have, it goes back to that choice. And we're going to keep talking about that. It goes back to each of us has the choice, the ability to make that decision. But yeah, if that were the case, we wouldn't have the choice. If all of those things that they just objected to, if that was the case, then there wouldn't be. I think, and I forget where I got this, if this was from Warren's book or if this was from a different book. And I think it is from Warren, though. It says the principle upon which this thinking is based would be, you could compare it to pulling a thorn out of a lion's paw. Like if there's something bothering you, like a splinter or whatever, and you pull it out, that in that one instance, that could be good, right? But if in this case, if you were to make all those changes, you wouldn't be pulling a thorn out of a paw. You'd be pulling out the entire nervous system of the lion. Like it would be a complete change, and it would radically change the rules that have been established for the world. Like it wouldn't be the world we're in. It would be something totally different. You can't simply extract pain from an animal in this world without changing the nature of the world. Because one of two situations would exist. Either the world would be changed so that it is no longer ruled by laws, and if that's the case, then morality cannot occur in such a chaotic environment. Stuart Hackett says, moral experience depends upon rationality, since morality is, in the final analysis, the rational conduct of life. But the rational conduct of life would be impossible in a world not sustained by regular laws and explicable in causal terms. So a law-abiding world is necessary for making moral and spiritual decisions, for that to be the case. If you don't have a law-abiding world, then the making of moral and spiritual decisions would not serve God's purpose. It would not matter. And in that case, also, the world would still be ruled by laws, but they would be different. For instance, water would have to have different properties for different situations. I think we kind of talked about this. It would need to be in its current form for us to drink, to be life-sustaining, but then it would have to be something different if you fell into it in order not to drown you. Like it would have to be able to change somehow, because it wouldn't fit each situation. Same thing with an axe. Like an axe would have to be sharp, be able to cut through wood, but if somebody tried to cut it and accidentally was going to cut themselves, or somebody was going to use it to kill someone, it would have to somehow not be sharp and not be able to cut. So I don't know, it's kind of like, I guess, as I think about it, it's kind of like The Matrix, if anybody's ever seen that movie, where things, like once they realize that they're not in the real world, they're able to manipulate and change what's happening within the fake world, so to speak. So it would have to be something like that, where things would be being changed and manipulated all the time. You know, it would, instead of being a world of laws, it would be a world of chaos. So Warren states that he believes that every instance of a natural calamity results from some condition which was necessary for God's providing man with the ideal environment for soul making. No person has the knowledge to explain completely the contribution of every instance of destruction or suffering to soul making. However, God has a morally justifiable reason for having created such a world. So it is possible to give an explanation consistent with the basic propositions which are crucial for dealing with the problem of evil to support biblical theism so that natural calamities do not cause a conflict with belief in the God of the Bible. So basically what he's saying there and kind of summing up, you know, we've been talking about this for a few weeks now, and we could have probably done this in one lesson and said, well, why does evil exist in the world? Because of our choice. Like that is the answer. But it's good, I think it's good anyway, to go deeper than that and to really think through some of these issues, because people really struggle with why would a storm wipe out a group of people? Or why does a child get sick? Or why do people have to suffer this way? Or why are people so evil? Or the question that Dave asked, you know, why is it so easy to take the wrong route, do the wrong thing? We struggle with that, and a lot of people struggle with that. So I think it's important that we keep on, and I know I'm repeating myself some, but we keep on driving home these things and what we see, and answering them as best we can. Like I said, we don't have all the answers. There's no way we can answer everything. But we want to keep on going down and get into the specifics of, well, what is the purpose of, you know, what purpose do natural calamities like tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes serve in making this world the perfect environment for what God established it, for soul making?
People come to rely on him, to turn to him for comfort, and
they can make us rely on God for sure. It can help with community, but not for those who have been killed by them or something like what, you know. That's where you kind of get that back and forth. Like we can come up with an explanation that says, well, it can draw us closer to God, it can make us rely on God, it can draw us closer together as people. But then the argument you might come back with was, well, that an atheist might come back with, or somebody who's struggling, well, why do we need that? Why can't we draw closer to God without that? Or to each other? Why can't we do that without it? And so I think that those answers are correct, but I think that they might come back with something that we would have to answer or be able to answer. You know, for one thing, it's important to remember that God did not create the world to be our final home. Like, how do we know that? Well, we know that because we're all going to die. Right? I mean, we know that. Unless something happens that causes this world to end, which is going to be what? The return of Jesus. Unless something like that, unless that happens, during our lifetime, which, by the way, we do need to be prepared for at every day of our life. We need to be ready for that occurrence. We have a tendency to think that it's not going to happen during our lifetimes, I think. At least I know I did for a long time. But we need to think about the fact that it could happen anytime, and we need to be ready for that. But if that doesn't happen, then we know that our end is going to be death. We are going to die. And some of us will die quickly, and some will linger on and suffer through our just getting older and aging. But we know that that's what's going to happen. But it's important to remember that God didn't create this world to be our final home. We're not going to stay here. We know that. And our life in this world is meant to be a probationary period, like what we talked about, in which we decide whether or not we're going to follow God's will. Natural calamities serve as a reminder that life on this earth will end at some point and that it is uncertain. They should remind us that this world is not our permanent home and should lead us to give serious thought about God and our response to him. I asked one of you guys back there to read James 4:13 through 5:5.
Okay. I have it turned on. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there, and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on earth in luxury and in self-indulgences. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter.
All right, so I think it's human nature to since we live here, and this is what we see, to come to a little bit at least to think of what we have, to rely on our possessions some. And especially that is true for people who have a lot. And we've talked about this before. In America, and it's not 100%, I mean, there are special cases, but in America, generally speaking, we are rich. That goes from the poorest of us to the richest of us. We are rich because America is a very rich nation as compared to the world in general. Now, like I said, there are exceptions. There are definitely poor people, and we see them around. And as Jesus said in one of his conversations, he said, "The poor you will always have with you." So we certainly see that. But as a general rule, America is considered to be a rich country. And what have we seen throughout history with rich countries? Do they tend to rely on God and be more religious, or do they tend to be not, like, more reliant on themselves and not faithful to God? I think everybody knows the answer to that, right? The more possessions people have and the richer people are, the less they tend. So what this is saying, I think, is don't rely, you have to make, those of you who are wealthy and rich have to make a special effort to not rely on those things, to not get your confidence in that. We remember the parable that Jesus told about the rich man who was had this big harvest, and he's like, well, what am I going to do with all this? And he said, I'll know what I'll do. He said, I'll just build bigger barns. Now, I don't think Jesus even mentions it, but what should he have done? Maybe he does say it in the parable, but what should he have done? I think the indication is, well, you take what you need, and then he should have given away the rest, or used the rest, or something, not hoarded it. And we have a tendency to do that. Now, what does that mean? You get into, does that mean that we shouldn't save? No, it doesn't mean we shouldn't save for the future. And here in this passage, when it says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, does that mean every time we talk about the future, we need to say, well, if the Lord wills it? I don't think so. I don't think it's meaning that every time we say something, we have to say, well, if God wills it, this is going to be the case. It's talking about our attitude and realize that we need to realize that the future is uncertain, and we can't rely on that. What happened to that in that parable with the rich farmer who had all that harvest and then built these barns? He died the next day, right? So what good did those barns do for him? So we need to really think about that and realize that, and these kind of things help us should help us to realize that our material possessions and those things they're not permanent. They're not something that we can rely on. Our being here on this earth is not permanent. We could be killed at any time, really, as far as that goes. And once again, going back, does that mean we should live in fear of dying every minute? No. But we just need to realize the temporary status of where we're at and the things we have and what we're doing here. I know one of the comments that my parents used to say was always, Lord willing and the creek don't rise, whenever we were talking about something in the future, because I guess, it used to be that when the creek, and we see even in the floods, you can't get past flooded areas sometimes. So, in other words, it's our intention to do this as long as we're able to. And of course, God willing, and the creek doesn't rise. So the knowledge that an act of nature can destroy all of one's material possessions in a very short period of time should help us to see that material things are not where we should put our focus. It should also help us to realize that things we build are temporary and that we should focus on things that will last. Since nothing on this earth will last forever, we should seek that what is permanent outside of earthly possessions. Jesus had something to say about where we should put our trust, and we want to read Matthew 6:25 through 34 on that.
Do not worry. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds in the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grasses of the fields, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run all of these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. All right, so this, of course, is Jesus. I think probably several of you, or most of you, have read this passage as part of the Sermon on the Mount, talking about the cure for anxiety. What should we be concerned with? And here again, there's a lot said in here where if you try to take it completely literally, maybe you come to the conclusion that we shouldn't think about tomorrow at all. But is that what Jesus is saying, not to think about tomorrow or not to think about the future at all? All right, there's other passages that we see that actually indicate that we should think about tomorrow to some degree, and that we should do things that help us to be prepared for the future and those things. Yeah, so, and I don't think that that's contradictory. What Jesus is saying here is, where should your focus be? And our focus should be on the spiritual things and seeking his will, his kingdom, and not on the material things here, or especially about being worried about things that we have no control over, because we spend so much time, often wasted time, thinking about things that we have no control over. So I think that that's what he's emphasizing, is that we should, where we need to put our trust is in God and not in those possessions, and that we shouldn't focus on the things that are here. And I don't think that that's saying that we can't, or that we shouldn't be prepared for the future, or that we need to think about things that are in the future, but just that we can't spend a whole lot of time focused on that, because we need to focus on the here and now and on serving him.
So the preparation for a Christian life, you need to spend time in God's Word. You need to spend time on your knees in prayer. You need to spend time coming to worship
Yeah, and that's focusing on the spiritual side of things. Like, what are things that we need to do every day? Some things daily, some things weekly, just depending on what they are. We need to do those things and focus on those things. And then, like I said, of course, there's the daily things that we need to do, and there's the things that we need to think about to prepare for the future. But we need to do that understanding that there is no guarantee for the future, that we don't know what the future holds. The element of uncertainty, I think, is important in relation to natural calamities. If we could be certain that we could avoid all calamities by where we lived or things like that, or by being a child of God and living as He wants us to, then that, if we talked about how it rains on the just and the unjust, or those kind of things, if we were truly just rewarded by being children of God and by serving, and how good we did and all the good things that we did, and if we were truly punished because we did bad things or evil things, that would be a great obstacle to having a decision to love and submit to God from the proper motive. It would be an obvious choice for people to do that if there were no possibility of anything bad befalling you because you were serving God, while in the meantime you could never get anything good from doing wrong things. It would not work. The fact that tornadoes and other natural calamities harm both the righteous and unrighteous enables them to serve as reminders that things are temporary, and it doesn't. They're not improper motivators, because you can't avoid that by being either good or bad. So the fact that it's equal, that it doesn't, tornadoes don't have a will of their own. Hurricanes don't have a will of their own. They don't just target a certain person or a group of people. They happen, they occur. Same with the earthquakes and things like that. So I think that allows them to be the proper motivators for us, and the proper things that we can see how uncertain and temporary things are here on earth, and we can't be shielded from that by our behavior. There's no way that we can just ignore those. Anybody have any other comments on natural calamities, or any thoughts or questions before we move on to? We only have about 5 minutes, so we're not going to get far into the next thing. So if anybody has anything they want to discuss here in relation to those things, or anything I haven't touched on that you think might need to be said, we can take a minute on it. All right, well then we'll move on to our next thing, and that is animal pain. So some people don't believe in God because they see instances of animal pain. Warren believes that every instance of animal pain results from some condition or conditions which were necessary to God's providing man with the ideal environment for soul making. So obviously the question, what purpose does animal pain serve in making the world an environment for soul making? Off the top of your head, what might you think? What are some things you can think of? Well, first off, before you even answer that, one thing is we don't really know exactly how animals do feel pain. I mean, how much they feel and exactly what it is, because we're not animals. We're in the animal kingdom, but we're not animals in that nature. And so we know how people feel pain and how we perceive pain. But we don't know exactly how animals do. Now, but we do know that they do feel pain. We know that. But we don't know exactly how. But what are some? What is the purpose? What do those animal pain serve?
Help somebody become more sympathetic.
More sympathetic? You've often heard that, looking at kids and how they treat animals, or at least I've heard this anyway, you can tell a lot about a person, or kids especially, but anybody, about how they treat animals, for sure. What about what we just talked about earlier? We talked about how the world would have to be changed in order for an animal not to feel pain, because the animal wouldn't know when to eat, when to drink, when to stop running or digging after it's injured, wouldn't know when to go to the bathroom. There's a lot of things that animals would not know needed to be done, or if they could feel no pain. So as we talked about earlier, pain's not good or bad, it serves a purpose. It can be good in a way, just like what we had talked about. And of course, with the world being created as the ideal place for man, for people to decide whether or not we will serve God, animals are a part of that creation. They're part of what God created for that purpose. Animals provide food, clothing, medicines, and other products that people use and develop to aid in living, right? And some people have problems with that, right? Some people don't like that. But that is what God said to people, that they were going to rule over the animals. Also, animals have served in creating power. The power for transportation, horses. Before the car, how did people get around? And still today, some may see people on the roads with horses and buggies and things like that, right? So horses, of course, cattle and oxen would be used in farming and those kind of things. So animals are very useful. They've also been used in advancement of science, learning things. Animals, of course, we see animals eating other animals. Is that evil?
Nature.
Or nature, yeah. And so some people have a problem with that. Some people see that as being a bad thing. Animals eating other animals is not intrinsically evil. It's simply an element of the environment that God has provided for us to make our decision as to whether we're going to follow God or not. Actually, I think this one's a pretty short one, so we might be able to get through here real quick. I might be a minute over, but so the environment is instrumental to providing humans with the purpose for which God created it, for us to be able to make the decision. And the animal kingdom is a part of that, and it serves. The existence of animals gives God a medium of teaching various spiritual truths to us as well. The Bible uses animals often to teach us lessons. If you look at like Proverbs 6:6, talks about, let me get there real quick. It says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise, which having no chief officer or ruler prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provision in harvest. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep?" So uses the ant, and then in chapter 30, you get a bunch of examples there. 24, 4 things are small on the earth, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are not a strong folk, but they prepare their food in the summer. The badgers are not a mighty folk, yet they make their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet all of them go out in ranks. The lizard you may grasp with the hands, yet it is in kings' palaces. There are 3 things which are stately in their march, even 4 which are stately when they walk. The lion, which is mighty among beasts, and does not retreat before any. The strutting cock, the male goat also, and a king when his army is with him. So the Bible, we can observe from animals and we can learn. And then, of course, God used animals as sacrifices in worship under the old law. You know, what did God teach us by having animals offered as sacrifices? What was the purpose of that? Life is in the blood, yeah. And it also taught us how bad sin is, right? Remember, it was a representation of how bad sin is and what's required to be reconciled to God. All right, well, we'll end there and pick up again next week on that. Like I said, we may be able to finish up this part of the series of lessons next week. We'll see. It might go one extra week. You never know. Depends on how things go. But we'll be back in, a little under 15 minutes now.